Ronald Whiles was 61 years old when his story became part of Lafayette history. To many who knew him, he was simply Ron, a man who kept his hands busy and his life steady through his small business, Ron's Lawns. For years he cut grass across town, moving from one yard to another like a steady clock that neighbors could rely on. The work was not glamorous, but it was honest, and in a community where routine matters, Ron became a familiar figure. His truck and tools were as recognizable as the mailman making his rounds. But mowing lawns was not enough to keep a household afloat. To help balance the books, Ron opened his home to boarders. He rented out rooms, giving a roof to those who needed a place when options were limited. For some it was a second chance, for others it was simply the bridge between hard times and stability. In that way, Ron's house became more than a residence. It became a halfway stop in life's long journey. People came and went, each carrying their own stories, and Ron stood at the center, offering a key and a door that few others would provide. This generosity was what defined him. In a world where doors are often closed and locks are double-checked, Ron's instinct was to open his. He carried a reputation as someone who looked out for people, especially those down on their luck. To his tenants and his neighbors, he was the man who would not turn you away if you needed a hand. Like a tree that offers shade to anyone who steps near, Ron provided cover, even when it meant stretching his own resources thin. Yet, the same openness that made him respected also carried risk. By renting rooms to a rotating cast of individuals, he invited unpredictability into his life. Trust was the currency he used, and while trust can build bridges, it can also hide cracks beneath the surface. In extending kindness, Ron allowed strangers into his home, and with each new arrival there was no guarantee of how the story would end. That risk would one day take shape in the most devastating way. A man who had built his life on steady work and simple trust would soon face the consequences of opening his door too wide. The very generosity that defined him would become the thread that pulled his world apart, leaving the question that still echoes in Lafayette. When does kindness cross into danger, and how can anyone tell before it is too late? On the morning of April 7, 2018, the calm of Lafayette was broken by a phone call to emergency dispatch. It was just after 6 o'clock when Tenant Thomas Day reported that something terrible was unfolding inside the home of his landlord Ronald Whiles. His voice carried urgency as he described smoke and the need for help. Like the first drops before a storm, the call marked the beginning of a chain of events that would reveal far more than a simple house fire. When firefighters arrived within minutes, they faced a wall of flames rising from the modest residence. The home, once a place of shelter for many, now looked like a furnace consuming every board and every memory inside. Fire crews fought to push back the blaze, their hoses cutting through the heat like rivers against dry earth. Neighbors watched from the street, their quiet subdivision turned into a scene that felt more like a disaster zone. But as the smoke began to lift, investigators noticed troubling signs. A fire alone tells one kind of story, but here the pieces did not add up. The flames had started in ways that suggested intent rather than accident. It was as if someone had lit a match not out of carelessness, but out of calculation. The fire was only the cover, hiding something darker beneath. Inside, after the fire was contained, the search for answers led to a discovery that would silence any remaining hope. Ronald Whiles, 61 years old, was found dead. His body bore multiple gunshot wounds. In a place where people expected to find belongings and furniture, detectives instead found evidence of violence layered with the aftermath of fire. The details became more disturbing with each step. Dressers were pulled open, drawers left hanging as if someone had rushed through them. Ron's wallet was found emptied, the contents missing, his pockets turned inside out. Scattered across the floor were spent shell casings from a .40 caliber handgun. These were not the signs of chance or misfortune. They were the marks of someone who had entered with purpose. The scene painted two overlapping stories. One was of a man shot inside his own home, left to die among his possessions. The other was of a fire set deliberately, its heat and smoke meant to erase the truth. Yet the fire did not succeed. Instead of destroying the evidence, it exposed it. For investigators, questions grew heavier than the smoke that morning. Was this crime about money, or was it about something more personal? Who would want Ron gone, and why use fire to disguise bullets? The answers would take months to uncover, but in those first hours the picture was already chilling. The home of a man known for giving shelter had become the site of his own violent end, and the search for who was responsible had only just begun. Thomas Day was the man who first reached for the phone on that April morning. At roughly 6 o'clock, he told dispatchers that his landlord, Ron Whiles, had been attacked. His voice carried the weight of panic as he described smoke filling the house. For investigators, his words were the first puzzle pieces, but like a jigsaw without its picture, the edges were difficult to place. According to Day, the morning began in confusion. He said he heard noises that did not belong in the calm of dawn. Shouts, movement, and then the smell of smoke. He told officers that when he looked for Ron, he saw signs of a struggle. The details he shared painted a picture of chaos, as though the home had turned into a storm where nothing was in its place. In Day's account, Ron had been caught in violence that escalated quickly, but as every detective knows, testimony is like a coin. One side shows an image, the other side may tell a different story. Day was a tenant, someone who had lived under Ron's roof, and his decision to call for help might have marked him as a responsible witness. Still, the question lingered. Was he only the man who sounded the alarm, or was there more beneath the surface? Investigators listened closely to his version of events, but they also walked the rooms themselves. They saw the drawers pulled wide, the wallet emptied, the shell casings scattered like breadcrumbs leading to a violent act. These were not details that lined up neatly with the story of a frightened tenant. Instead, they raised possibilities. Could someone inside the home have staged their own story? Could panic also be a disguise? For the detectives, comparing words against evidence was like holding up a map to the terrain. If the roads did not match the landmarks, then something was off. Day's account of confusion had to be weighed against the precision of the crime scene. Gunfire does not come without purpose. Arson does not spark without intent. Robbery leaves its own trail. Did Day truly witness these events as he described, or was his story trimmed to fit a safer picture? Neighbors, meanwhile, remembered seeing him outside as the smoke poured out, a tenant seemingly as shaken as anyone else. That fact leaned in his favor, yet detectives had learned long ago that appearances can mislead. A frightened face can hide calculation, just as calm words can hide fear. As the investigation moved forward, Thomas Day's role remained a thread worth pulling. He was either the man who acted quickly to call for help, or a man who knew more than he admitted. In those early days, the uncertainty around his account kept the case balanced on a knife's edge. It was a reminder that in every crime scene, witnesses can be both windows into the truth and doors that lead investigators in the wrong direction. The challenge was to know which one Thomas Day would prove to be. As detectives sifted through the smoke and silence left behind in Ron Whiles' home, one name began to surface: Andrew Scott Alcorns. He was not a stranger to Ron, not an outsider passing through town. He was someone who had once lived under Ron's roof, someone who had been given a place to stay when he needed it most. For a time, their connection was like a bridge built out of necessity and trust. Yet bridges can crack under weight, and theirs eventually collapsed. Andrew's history with Ron was complicated. At first, he was another tenant, part of the revolving circle of people Ron helped, but conflict grew, and Ron eventually evicted him. To be told to leave was more than losing shelter. It was losing stability, and for Andrew, it may have planted a seed of resentment. Detectives began to see this eviction not just as a moment in the past, but as a turning point that may have shaped the violence to come. Financial pressure weighed heavily on Andrew's life. He was no stranger to hardship, and money seemed to slip through his fingers like water through a sieve. Investigators discovered that before Ron's death, Andrew had spoken of robbing him. It was not the sort of conversation that happens in passing. It was a sign of motive, the kind of red flag that detectives circle in bold ink. To those who pieced the puzzle together, it was the sound of intent hiding in plain sight. The betrayal at the heart of this story was striking. Ron had a reputation for helping people, and Andrew was one of those people. He had been given shelter when he needed it. The kindness was there, as solid as the roof above him. Yet kindness can sometimes be misread as weakness. For detectives, the idea that Andrew could turn on the very man who once helped him was as chilling as the crime itself. It was like watching someone cut down the very tree that had given them shade. The evidence was not yet conclusive, but suspicion began to tighten around Andrew. His history with Ron gave investigators a narrative that fit. Eviction created bitterness. Money created need. Conversations about robbery created motive. The pieces aligned like stones on a path, each one leading closer to him. Still, questions remained. Did Andrew act alone? Was this crime truly the result of a man pushed by desperation, or were there deeper influences pressing him forward? The picture was not yet complete, but investigators were no longer staring at a blank canvas. They had a face, they had a story, and they had a trail that was growing clearer by the day. As the investigation deepened, the name Andrew Scott Alcorns was no longer just one possibility among many. It was the thread investigators could not let go, and the more they pulled, the more it seemed that this former tenant was tied to the betrayal and murder of the man who once gave him shelter. The investigation into the death of Ronald Whiles moved slowly at first, like a river finding its way through rock, but over time the current grew stronger, and one name kept reappearing: Andrew Scott Alcorns. Detectives did not rely on rumor alone. They leaned on science, on records, and on the kind of details that cannot be erased by smoke or silence. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. One of the first major breakthroughs came from the shell casings found at the scene. Scattered across the floor of Ron's home, they were silent witnesses to the gunfire that ended his life. Ballistic testing revealed they had been fired from a .40 caliber handgun. Months later, investigators recovered a stolen weapon from the community, and when that firearm was tested, the match was exact. Like a fingerprint in metal, the marks confirmed the casings from Ron's home had come from that very gun, and detectives had reason to believe Andrew had handled it. Evidence did not end there. Technology provided its own trail. From inside a jail, Andrew's girlfriend, Paige Milliken, had spoken to him over recorded phone calls. In conversations that left little room for doubt, robbery was discussed. The calls showed not only knowledge of Ron, but intent. They were like open windows into planning, revealing words that could not be taken back. For investigators, those calls connected motive to action in a way testimony alone never could. Witness accounts also pushed the focus further toward Andrew. People who knew him recalled his conflicts with Ron and spoke of his anger after being forced out of the home. In small-town communities, words travel like ripples in a pond, and Andrew's frustrations were no secret. These statements gave detectives a sense of the emotional storm brewing behind the crime. Surveillance evidence added still another layer. Footage placed Andrew near key locations, stitching together his movements with the timeline of the murder. Like dots on a map, his presence aligned too closely with the moments of violence to be coincidence. When combined with the weapon, the phone calls, and the witness statements, the case was no longer a vague outline. It was a full sketch taking on sharper lines with every detail. For investigators, building a case is much like weaving a net. A single thread cannot hold much, but when enough threads cross, the net becomes unbreakable. The forensic science, the calls from Paige, the witness voices, and the surveillance all became threads pointing directly at Andrew. Each breakthrough narrowed the field of doubt. By the time all the pieces were laid out, detectives no longer spoke of him as one of many possibilities. He had become the central figure in the investigation. The question was no longer if Andrew was connected, but how he would respond when faced with the evidence that circled him on every side. Andrew Scott Alcorns did not simply walk into custody. His arrest unfolded with the tension of a storm pressing against a small-town horizon. Detectives had already built their case, but the final step required them to bring him in. That task proved anything but simple. Police tracked Andrew with the persistence of hunters following faint tracks in the woods. Surveillance, tips, and hours of groundwork narrowed his location. When officers finally moved in, it was not with the calm of a routine traffic stop. It was the beginning of a standoff that stretched nerves to their limit. Andrew refused to surrender quietly. For a time, the scene became a standoff of words and weapons. Neighbors later recalled the eerie silence broken only by shouts of command. To many, it felt like watching a chess match where one wrong move could topple the board. Police surrounded the area, knowing they had to contain the situation before it spilled into chaos. The standoff turned violent when shots were fired. In the exchange, Andrew was struck. The wound did not claim his life, but it marked the moment the balance.
Shot fired! Shot fired!
Somebody hit?
Yes, ma'am.
Somebody got shot?
Yes, ma'am.
The whole situation seems really chaotic for there to be one person who was shot, one person who was stabbed, and the whole house to be set on fire. And obviously, one of the first things investigators wanted to do was talk to Thomas. In his statement, he said that sometime around 6 a.m., he was woken up to the sound of what he thought were firecrackers going off in the house. So he opens the bedroom door, and that's where he says he saw an intruder pointing a gun at Ron. So he jumps on this dude, and suddenly he starts feeling what he thought was the intruder punching him really, really hard, but he was actually being stabbed. He is able to get away from him, and he crawls back into his bedroom, and that's where he makes the 911 call. So with Thomas off the table as a suspect, they had to go back to square one. Who would want to kill Ron Whiles, and why?
Loss and betrayal. As news of the arrest spread, the question that lingered was not whether justice would proceed, but how a community would reconcile the knowledge that one of their own had turned kindness into tragedy. In September of 2021, the long wait for justice reached a turning point. Inside the courtroom, Andrew Scott Alcorn stood before a judge and admitted what investigators had uncovered years earlier. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Ron Whiles and to aggravated battery. The words carried the weight of every piece of evidence, every sleepless night for detectives, and every tear shed by Ron's family. The plea spared the community a long trial, but it did not spare anyone from the solemn gravity of the moment. A guilty plea is like the final move in a long game of chess. Each decision before it matters, but this move locks the outcome in place. For Ron's loved ones, hearing the admission was both crushing and relieving. The man who betrayed Ron had finally faced the truth, and yet that truth reopened the pain of what had been stolen. 2 months later, in November of 2021, the sentencing arrived. The judge handed down 60 years for murder and 15 years for aggravated battery. By Indiana law, the sentence was capped at 70 years. The numbers, though cold and precise, spoke volumes. They represented a life behind bars, a reminder that choices carry consequences and that betrayal of trust can never be undone. The courtroom that day was heavy with silence, broken only by the sound of verdicts being read and family members quietly holding back tears. To those who loved Ron, the sentence was not a victory. It was a measure of accountability, a recognition by the justice system that his life had value and his death demanded answers. Some described a sense of relief as though a heavy door had finally closed. Others felt only sorrow, knowing no sentence could ever bring Ron back. Justice, in this case, did not feel like celebration. It felt like standing at the end of a long road, scarred by grief yet steadied by truth. Ron's kindness had been met with cruelty, and now the law had spoken with finality. The chapter closed in that courtroom, but the echo of what happened to Ron Whiles would remain in the hearts of those who knew him. Ron Whiles was remembered not only for how his life ended, but for how he chose to live it. He was known as a man who gave when he did not have to, who opened his home to those who had nowhere else to go. His lawn care business kept him busy, yet his true legacy was the quiet generosity that touched the lives of many. Like a porch light left on at night, his kindness was a signal of welcome for anyone who needed shelter. That light, however, became the very thing that drew danger to his doorstep. By offering a second chance to people who were struggling, Ron also exposed himself to risk. His murder was not just the loss of one man. It was a wound that reached deep into Lafayette. Neighbors spoke of their grief with voices weighed down by disbelief. The fire that consumed his home left scars not only on the property, but also on the collective spirit of a community that had to face how quickly kindness could be twisted into opportunity for harm. The lessons from this tragedy linger like echoes in an empty room. Trust is a gift, but it carries the shadow of vulnerability. Generosity is noble, yet it sometimes opens doors to those who may not honor it. Ron's story became a mirror, forcing many to reflect on the hidden dangers that can live alongside good intentions. On a broader scale, the case showed how violence born of betrayal shakes entire communities. Domestic arson and murder are not crimes that affect only one family. They ripple outward, unsettling everyone who wonders how such a thing could happen so close to home. Betrayal has always carried a sharper edge than ordinary conflict. It is the difference between an open hand and a clenched fist, between trust given and trust destroyed. Ron's death is remembered as more than a crime. It is remembered as a tragic reminder that the very act of kindness can sometimes place a person in harm's way. His final gesture of trust gave someone a second chance, but it also gave them access to his life. That access was used not to honor his generosity, but to end it forever. The haunting truth is that Ron's story closes not with the crime itself, but with the painful irony that his greatest strength was also the path to his greatest vulnerability. If Ron's story moved you, let it serve as more than a memory. It is a reminder of the value of community, the need to protect one another, and the importance of speaking out when something feels wrong. Share this story to keep his legacy of kindness alive, and join us here for more true stories that reveal both the light and the shadows of human nature. Do not forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter.